Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Hitman. This was directed by Richard Linklater. This is actually a collaboration between Glen Powell and Linklater, and the two have worked together in the past. But it has been a while since I've seen a Linklater film, and he's a director that I have an immense amount of respect for. He's made, I think, some of the great contemplative hangout movies, and I've grown up on so many of them. I think he established a very comfortable, very mature style early on in his career, and I think that allowed him to branch out a little bit more later in his career so far as subject matter, putting a spin on genre and style. But those existential themes are always kind of floating around in the stratosphere of the movie, or it's, you know, on the tip of people's tongues, and that kind of weaves everything together for me. And Hitman, I'd say, carries a lot of that feeling. But I mean, it's very clear from the opening scene that yes, it is the same filmmaker with the same, you know, pondering the same types of ideas, but just in a way that surprised me. I haven't seen Linklater make a film quite like this before. It is a very kind of twisty neo-noir that is also, I'd say, a dark comedy, but it settles into more of a romantic film, a love story. And the premise is colorful, but it's loosely based on a real story. We have Gary Johnson, who is a smart guy. He seems to be curious on all kinds of different subjects. He is a philosophy professor at the University of New Orleans, but he also works part-time for the police department. And he ends up becoming like a fake hitman for hire for sting operations, and it is something he completely falls into, but he turns out to quite like it, and he's also very good at it. It allows him to be an actor of sorts. You know, he gets to wear different wigs and put on different accents and do all kinds of research, luring criminals into a sort of trap while he gets to remain in control of the situation overall. It allows him not only to escape certain aspects of himself that maybe he's associated with, being maybe too safe, maybe too boring or whatever, and a little bit nerdy, but he can also activate maybe the more honest sides of himself through the act of performance. And that's instantly the angle of the film I found to be the most interesting, how performance, the social masks that we wear, can affect our lives and our relationships in all kinds of ways we don't realize, how our perceptions of somebody based on that can cloud our morality as well. Linklater is such a veteran at this point, and even when he makes films that I don't love, I don't think he ever makes a bad film. I would say overall, most of his films are very solid, and they tend to be more thoughtful than most. And the same can be said for this one. I think it's, you know, talent and experience that he can kind of keep the love story and the humor and all the existential questions we're pondering, you know, nice and steady throughout. The film has a lot of influences, clearly, and yet none of them ever feel too cheeky or too smug. They actually touch the ground, and they actually weave themselves into the plot of the story with actual cohesion, rather than just being self-aware for the sake of being self-aware like we see in so many movies these days. And I like the fact that they even call attention to the fact that, like, the hitman is so romanticized in pop culture, particularly American pop culture. You know, he's considered to be like this masculine, dominant type of guy, but, you know, like the outsider, the rogue badass. The way that we romanticize that particular archetype is a huge part of the film, both for Gary Johnson and for Madison, who is the femme fatale here, or the love interest in the film. Because that is how our characters are introduced. Madison hires Gary, who she thinks is a real hitman, and he's going by the name Ron here, and she wants him to kill her abusive husband. And it's all about perceptions. She sees him, obviously, as one thing. He sees her maybe as another thing. She's somebody who seems to be very, very kind and very nurturing, but, you know, she's also very turned on by the idea of like a male protector, like this masculine guy, you know, who can save her. And all of that is, you know, again, very titillating, and he's naturally going to lean right into that because he wants that piece of ass. But again, that is for me the most interesting aspect of the film, the idea of role play, that, you know, by lying to her, he starts to weirdly find a confidence within himself, a sexual confidence and a masculine magnetism that maybe he didn't have before. And that is perhaps the power of acting as an art form and just performance in real life. And I think it's interesting to use like a romantic relationship between two people as the framework for all of these ideas, because, you know, naturally in romance, the stakes are going to be raised compared to a normal relationship, and reality is going to be clouded due to pheromones. It's more reality setting in maybe a little bit later. And that is part of why we use sexual role play in romantic relationships, to keep things interesting, to keep the flame going and to keep some creativity, some spark. But it allows you to push deeper so far as sensation and connection, you know, trust with your partner. So all of that is good, but I think role play also, it often reveals more that it conceals, ironically. And they definitely play into that just a little bit in the film, and I kind of enjoyed that. I would have enjoyed maybe a little bit more of that. I also like it when he's going into these long explanations to her about what he does, about his job and his life, his background. And it's so specific, so detailed, and it's completely made up. And so, I don't know, it's very funny, and the way that Powell delivers a lot of the lines is very funny. But as I said, you know, true love may not be built on illusions, but illusions and idealism deeply play into attraction, and that starts to make reality harder later on when we start deciding, oh, maybe we do want a future together. So I like this as a film noir, and you have all the classical elements with those plot twists, but it's also got some old school kind of screwball comedy. This is definitely one of those movie star making vehicles. It's supposed to be a showcase of chemistry between the two leads, because I think that is what the heart of the film is about. It is about the love story, and I think that Powell has a really, you know, great sense of humor. As I said, he has a magnetism to him that's very important. And I would say this is kind of like a dream role for an actor. It really gives them a chance to play in their own environment. It's like, not only does he get to try on all these different accents, different costumes and wigs and all of that, but he also gets to settle into like a romantic leading man status too. That's clearly what Hollywood wants him to be, and I can kind of dig the energy overall. I like that Powell always keeps Gary's intelligence intact. It keeps that kind of at the forefront of the character, because, you know, it's important to understand how his wheels turn. Gary, as a university professor, I think is a very convenient and clever way of constantly interjecting a lot of the moral questions of the film, but through these class lecture settings. So that way our hero and the audience is always presented with this crossroads before moving into the obstacle course each time. And the idea of Gary becoming this fake hitman is just so silly and so outlandish, and yet I think it does work, again, due to the way that Gary is set up, the fact that, you know, he's like a really, you know, nerdy guy. He's very curious, the things that he talks about. He's fascinated by science, he's fascinated by the world, and his ability to observe and be resourceful is clearly his talent, and that becomes a part of his job. Madison, as the femme fatale, I think she offsets a lot of his hardness quite well, which I think is important, but the character did feel to me to be a little bit underwritten. I thought her character was interesting, but it felt like she was constantly being reduced to just like the woman who's really horny for the guns, more than somebody who is struggling with her own moral dilemmas, and, you know, somebody who also has some surprises of her own so far as her personality is concerned. I think more emphasis on the darker aspects of her character would have made her more interesting, and just the relationship more interesting. My problem with Glen Powell, though, I don't think it's necessarily all of his fault, because I think part of it has to do with the writing. He's still just a little too removed for me as a presence. There is a lack of real vulnerability in his demeanor that I think would help the second half of this movie in particular really sizzle. Like I've said, you know, I think the movie has a lot of interesting elements, and it's held together very well, and yet it just wasn't quite doing it for me. It wasn't quite lighting my fire. I found myself appreciating it more than I was really having like a visceral reaction to it. I think part of it has to do with, in the second half of the movie, the way the comedy is handled in the midst of, you know, darker drama. To a degree, yes, it is part of what keeps everything light and airy in the movie, but it also keeps the film, I think, from going to some interesting places. Keeping the comedic tone allows for, I think, the two leads to get away with things where we can still find them likable and we still want to root for them. But at the same time, a lot of the comedy had kind of a labored feeling to it, and I think it keeps a lot of, again, a lot of those interesting moral questions that our characters are discussing from ever truly being tested in a real way. With Gary, even though he finds more about himself through this like masculine persona that he plays, I don't think he ever reveals the true honesty, especially when it comes to the love story. You know, it's like he's playing all of these different characters, and yet I don't buy that Gary has much of an arc really at all. But perhaps that is also part of the point. That's part of the humor, you know, knowing that, you know, he had potential always within him. He just had to find it in his heart to like ditch the jorts, you know? But yes, there's just a lot of scenes in this movie that I felt like could have been really funny, or they could have really been anxiety ridden. Maybe a combination of the two I would have liked to see a lot. Especially there's one scene towards the end that's very unexpected. You know, it's like a big twist where an unexpected visitor comes to visit Madison at her home. But because we never get a sense that Gary has very much to learn, even in the midst of harrowing circumstances like that, we don't feel the impact of it, or we don't feel what he has to lose, because we just never see him struggle enough with the possibility of not getting his way. So, you know, I just wanted a little bit more oomph to this one, a little bit more spice to this movie. Had it really gone for it, I could have seen this as being maybe one of my favorite films of the year so far, but again, it's just a little bit too safe, and I like for my cages to be rattled a little bit. But that makes it, I think, a perfect Netflix type of release. It's not a movie that I would go see in the movie theaters, but it's certainly a movie that I would sit back on a Sunday afternoon and be like, oh, what's this? Let's check this out. I am interested in seeing how this movie is going to be received by audiences, whether they will think it's really funny, if it will touch a nerve, or if not. But certainly a solid effort for Powell and for Linklater, and I think it's a good thing, like a stepping stone, a really big stepping stone for somebody like Glen Powell. So, you know, I'm curious to see what he does in the future. Let's just hope as his profile grows that he starts to take roles that challenge him a little bit more. But yeah, that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website. As always, it is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist. I do commissioned portraits, and I also sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are great. Guys, thank you so much for your support. Welcome to all the new members. If you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.